Hi, good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to this short conversation about some of the things that are happening around displacement, demolitions, and evictions in Palestine, both in East Jerusalem and in Area C. My name is Sahar. I coordinate the Israel program for AFSC, and with me is Dawood, who's the country rep for Palestine and Israel. And Dawood, I think you're gonna start us off.
Yes, hi everyone again, and thank you for joining us in this quick conversation. So I will talk about the historical part and how things developed until reaching this point, and then allow for my colleague Sahar to continue to update you on what's happening on ground. As you all know, Jerusalem was historically a very tense city. Between religions, even politically and religiously, creating tensions between religions and inside even the same religion. So there was always a fight on Jerusalem, who's controlling Jerusalem. This means political power, but also this means religious power that gives legitimacy for the controlling power. And this what continued until today, actually. What happened in 1948, that when Israel established, it controlled the west of Jerusalem, evacuated the west of Jerusalem from Palestinian population and replaced it with a Jewish population. Most of this evacuated Palestinian population moved to parts in what is called now East Jerusalem. And later in 1967, Israel occupied this part of Jerusalem. And since then, and since the establishing of Israel, actually, Israel started to use a policy, a conquer policy, historical policy, which is divide and conquer. So they started to enforce different laws and frameworks that divide between the Palestinian fractions all around historical Palestine, inside Israel and in the areas of West Bank and Jerusalem. So directly after 67, they announced the annexing of East Jerusalem. But at the same time, they didn't give nationality for the Palestinians inside East Jerusalem. They gave them a sorry for that, residency permits, temporary one, as people living in the city. So they are not citizens. They are not Israeli citizens. They are not considered Palestinian citizens now. They only are residents in these East Jerusalem area. With the special laws, they have their own special legal frameworks that control this population, that also in daily life differentiate them from everyone else living in Israel or in Palestine. Now, and this continued to be the main theme of the Israeli policy in East Jerusalem until the 90s, when Oslo Agreement was signed and the peace agreement was started to be discussed. As you all know, when Oslo signed, there were different things that was agreed in that peace agreement, but Jerusalem as a city had been kept as a separated topic to be negotiated later. Starting from there, things started to change within the Israeli political elite. How they are visioning Jerusalem, what they are doing, and how they are want to implement this vision. Mainly, and starting from the right wing. Now, again, until Oslo Accords, the city was literally divided into two areas: the west side of Jerusalem with a Jewish population, and the east part of Jerusalem with a majority Palestinian population, and some small settlements here and there that didn't really create any how to say it in English. It wasn't like really huge to influence the demographic balance in the city, except of course for the Jewish quarter that was created inside the old city of Jerusalem, directly after 67 war. So it was easy when the negotiations started of Oslo in the 90s. It was easy to differentiate between what is Palestinian and what is Israeli. And it was easy for Palestinians to demand East Jerusalem as a capital, and to say that these are the areas of the majority Palestinian population. That's why, since then, since 96 actually, the Israeli political elite started a new strategy of scattered settlements, expansions in the city, and huge blocks of settlements to be created. And also started to encourage Jewish immigration to the city in different ways, not only from outside Israel, but also from inside Israel. The first step was inside the old city. So before there was a Jewish quarter, and the idea was to expand that Jewish quarter. After the 90s, the strategy became to buy different houses in different places in the old city, scattered everywhere. So you can't go to the old city and say this is a Jewish part or this is a Palestinian part. Then they started planting different settlements within the city, and that meant automatically to confiscate what was empty lands or green areas and built on it different settlements blocks. And then, now they started to think about linking these settlements and blocks together. In 2000, when the second Intifada started, another thing that started to happen. The Jewish migration to Israel started to become even balanced or negative for the first time of the history of Israel. So also they were not expecting, the Israeli political elite and leadership was not expecting that there will be new Jewish immigrants to the to Israel in the numbers they are hoping or imagining. Totally the opposite. The Jews who are leaving Israel started to become much higher than the newcomers to Israel. Again, this has created another challenge in the city. And with the Intifada and with the revolution and all ongoing confrontations in the city and outside of the city, also the statistics were clearly showing that by 2050, the majority of the city population will be almost 50% Palestinians. And today it's around 35% Palestinians. Another problem is an internal Jewish problem that also another 35 or 33% of the city population is religious Jews who are heavily depending on receiving services from the state and from the municipality. So in 2003, when all the Israeli elite strategic think tanks started to come together in Herzliya conference under Sharon government, they were saying that 1/3 of the city are enemy, another 1/3 is non-productive, and just a few third population that is secular Jews who are living in the city and who are connected to this elite. And they started thinking about how to change this with all these new data that is coming. Negative migration to Israel, confrontation that does not allow really a growth. City until today is considered the poorest city in income per person in Israel. Very unbalanced touristic industry in the city and so on. So how they can do this, how they can change the reality of the city, enforce this elite secular Jewish political elite minority control over the city, and so in a way that no one could say that this is a Palestinian part that could be given back to the Palestinians in any future peace negotiations. From there, they started developing a plan. In 2005, they published it in 7,000 pages. What they want to do in the city until 2020. Then for different reasons, this plan was extended to 2030 and until 2050. The plan talked about every small aspect in the city. Every corner, every street, every house, every land, it didn't leave anything. But again, we are talking about this in a negative migration to Israel. So they can't build new houses because at the end, there are no new inhabitants to come to the houses. This is why they started, on one hand, raising prices of housings in Tel Aviv and central areas of Israel, and giving tax exemptions for especially young couples to move to settlements in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem mainly. And at the same time, they started a so-called development plan for the city of Jerusalem. In this development plan, they didn't talk about housing, they talked about the infrastructure of the city. So suddenly, until 2023, we started to see huge and massive infrastructure construction in the city, and of different types. So for example, they are talking about telepheric, and maybe Sahar, you can talk about how this is related. Train lines, highways, a new biblical garden next to the old city and the Jewish quarter, touristic sites, malls, many different types of infrastructure that does not require people to come and live in them. But it does require to confiscate as much as possible of land to be built. And until today, also the city, especially the old city, which is the center of the conflict in Jerusalem, 2/3 of this old city is surrounded by a Palestinian population. Again, how this will be changed? Simply by confiscating all the area around Jerusalem, starting from Silwan, the graves in the east, Rockefeller Museum in the north, until reaching north of the old city area. It's a commercial area that will remain Palestinian, but behind it, it will be a huge settlement construction starting from the Green Line in northwest Jerusalem and ending in Rockefeller in east north Jerusalem. It's a full half circle of settlements, public buildings, governmental buildings, and different types of infrastructure, even a technological part at some point from in areas of Sheikh Jarrah, Wadi al-Joz, Suwane, and around Rockefeller Museum. By this, they are hoping that by 2030 and 2050, they will be capable of surrounding 2/3 of the city by a Jewish continuous infrastructure and housing and touristic sites and so on, and keep, again, only the north part as a Palestinian style commercial area, but that part will be surrounded from the north again by other different. So at some point, the old city will be disconnected totally from all the Palestinian neighborhoods and suburbs and metropolitan physically by one line of settlements and the infrastructure that is related to these settlements. Another thing, in the different areas of the city, again, you could see that some areas are easily to differentiate what is Israeli and what could be given back to the Palestinians as Palestinian neighborhoods. Even in these neighborhoods, they started different projects, again, of infrastructure. Some small settlements here and there, scattered settlements, units of settlements here and there, sometimes big blocks that are scattered everywhere. So they do not allow for any negotiation or a real physical distinguishing between Palestinian neighborhoods and non-Palestinian neighborhoods. Again, this is to keep control over the city, to ensure that the growth of the secular Jews in the city becomes 50% by 2050, and non-Jews and Palestinians or religious Jews percentage reduced to only 50% from now 70% almost. And this will allow them to keep the control of the city for the future and kill any negotiation over the city. What is happening today is actually implementing the project that was announced in 2005, step by step. Postponing some sections of that was because of even the political atmosphere, the tension in the city, the objection of the European Union or European countries, the US foreign policy, different reasons. Some sections were postponed. But until now, every year or every 10 years, actually, they are postponing this plan and still insisting on enforcing this plan in the city. I will stop here to allow for Sahar for more really what's happening on the ground. So should we take questions now, or I think what Sahar will say is very important related to what's happening. It completes what the historical background that I presented. So I prefer to keep the questions to after Sahar. تفضلي Sahar.
Great, thanks. So I'll speak a bit about some of the cases that are happening now. I just want to respond to the comment that Philip had here on the comments around the fact that there were, of course, settlements already in the 70s growing, like Pisgat Ze'ev, Ramot, and so on. I think it's important to say that when we speak about Jerusalem, we're speaking about two things at the same time. Some people, when they talk about Jerusalem, are talking about the old city. And some people, when they talk about Jerusalem, are talking about the entire 70 square kilometers around it. And I think we use the two, we change between the two quite a bit. So really the focus on settlements within the old city that, again, started before, but their increase and growth within the old city and in the neighborhoods just surrounding it and what's called the Holy Basin, quote unquote, those were really focused on in the 90s, and this shift from the kind of 70s settlements that were a lot about taking over land and a lot of agricultural land that was taken there, to now this kind of these settlements in the 90s that grew, as Dawood said, with specific intention of preventing the idea of a Palestinian capital in that area and access to the old city for that Palestinian capital. So that's just kind of in response to what Philip was saying, which is definitely obviously true as well. And so what we're seeing now really is, what does it look like when settlers are targeting these neighborhoods of the old city and around the old city, with Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan being two of these neighborhoods, Sheikh Jarrah to the north and Silwan to the south, that are really being targeted now. And this is first of all done by settler takeovers. Now these takeovers have quite a few different shapes. So some of them are based on the fact that some of these lands are lands that Jews lived in before 1948. And so what's happening now is that Israel is enforcing ownership laws pre-48 and allowing Jews to claim pre-48 lands or houses, which Palestinians are not allowed to do. And I think this is a very important point about this. Every single Palestinian in Sheikh Jarrah that is now under threat of eviction because that land might have been Jewish before 48, and this is what the eviction is based on, they all have houses in West Jerusalem, in Haifa, in what today is Jaffa, and in all of these areas, because they're refugees from these areas, but they can't demand that land back. So this is a clearly racist use of a law in which Jews can demand lands before 48 and Palestinians can't. And this is what we're seeing in neighborhoods like Sheikh Jarrah. The threats of evictions there are based on that law. We also see another form of threat of evictions, which is when settlers try to either buy Palestinian houses, sometimes legally, sometimes buying them from people who don't even own them. We kind of see a lot of different things happening around that. And there's also another option, which is absentee property. So Palestinians that in 67, when Israel occupied the West Bank, if they were in Jordan at the time, or in the rest of the West Bank, not in Jerusalem, at the time of the annexation, their houses become what's known as absentee property, are passed to the state, and then later on passed to settler organizations. So there's all these different technical legal ways for settler movements to take over Palestinian houses. But the bottom line of all of these are, first of all, discriminatory laws by definition. And secondly, this ideology of trying to Judaize these areas, right? And that is, I think, really the important point to remember. And right now, we are at a very crucial time. In Sheikh Jarrah, have been legal cases trying to evict Palestinian houses for close to 50 years now, since the beginning of the 70s. But we're coming to the point where these legal proceedings are coming to the end. There've already been a few houses evicted in this area in 2008, 2009, and a big protest movement managed to prevent the continuance of those evictions. And today we're seeing those evictions being geared up again. It is important to say, just as how relevant this is, that right now, on August 2nd, there's going to be a Supreme Court case that might really determine a lot of the future of these families, and will allow, hopefully not, but has the possibility of allowing these evictions to become imminent in Sheikh Jarrah. In Silwan, we're seeing the same things. The court cases are still going to be only in August, but the same idea of the moment these court cases happen and end, it is likely that these Palestinian families will be able to be evicted, and in masses. I mean, currently we're talking about 1,500 Palestinians in these two neighborhoods that are under threat of eviction in different legal statuses, but in imminent threat of eviction in the next few months. And Israel really wants to present this as a technical legal issue. There are these laws. People are asking the court to evict squatters, right? It's almost like that's the legal framing. Well, what we need to remember is that this is obviously political, right? And it's based on racist laws, and it is with a racist intention. And that really needs to be the focus of a lot of how we talk about this. And we can see a lot of global protest around it. You can follow different people who both Mohammed al-Qud and Munna al-Qud, who are two very prominent Palestinian activists from Sheikh Jarrah, whose house is under threat of eviction. Half their house has already been taken over by settlers. There's a lot of people talking about kind of the details of that. But that's one thing that's happening. And I think the other aspect of that is that we talk a lot. There's a lot of conversation these days about these house evictions and settler takeovers. But the other aspect of that is house demolitions. And so in a neighborhood, for instance, like Silwan, where we're seeing Palestinians are taken out of their homes and settlers are brought into their homes, in the same neighborhood, just last week, we also saw a demolition of a Palestinian house, and there's another 92 houses within Silwan in an area called the Bustan neighborhood that are under threat of demolition. So there's kind of these two layers, one theoretically done by courts and civilians evicting people, and another one that's done by the municipality of demolition. And what they're doing is two layers of the same thing. On the one hand, having Palestinians lose lands there, their homes in one way or another, and on the other hand, putting Jews into that land. And so this Judaization is not just about bringing Jews in, it's obviously also about taking Palestinians out in whatever ways possible, expelling Palestinians. And in effect, I mean, it is very clear that the goal here, when we say Judaization is one side, the other side of it is ethnic cleansing, right? And I think we won't have a lot of time to talk about this in a general context, but what we're seeing in Jerusalem is also things we're seeing throughout the West Bank, in Area C, in the areas that Israel has full administrative control of in the West Bank. and so also is responsible for house demolitions. We're seeing the same idea of trying to demolish Palestinian houses to get communities to leave, with the same concept of ethnic cleansing, with the idea of, if it's not legally, at least de facto, annexing that land, allowing settlements to expand. And so while Jerusalem is a very specific case and it has all the political context that Dawood was also mentioning, obviously this is part of a much broader issue throughout the West Bank of really takeover of land and ethnic cleansing de facto. I think it's important to mention some of the things also that AFSC is involved in around this. One of the important things that we're talking about now is that the McCollum law that started with saying that U.S. taxes should not be paying for child arrest, which should be pretty basic, but is now also being expanding to say it also shouldn't be paying for house evictions. Obviously, this also includes evictions of children from their homes, but generally house evictions, demolitions, and really seeing this as not just a human rights issue, but one that U.S. taxpayers have a responsibility for because of the relationship between the U.S. government and the Israeli government that is implementing all of this. So there's a lot of links that are going to be put in the chat here that you can look into, action alerts that you can join, more information that you can see, and so that's really things that are really important to join, because again, this is imminent. And I think in May, when there were huge Palestinian protests around the issue of Sheikh Jarrah, that eventually also were picked up in Gaza, and we really saw that this became like a national Palestinian issue. With all the consequences of that, today we don't see that in the headlines anymore, and we don't see it in the headlines because there isn't, that kind of violence that we saw in May might not be happening, but the reasoning for it, these evictions, this displacement, that's still happening, and we have to continue to be aware of that. We have to continue to bring it to the headlines. It can't be in the headlines only when there's bombing of Gaza, right? It needs to be in the headline all the time, because this displacement is happening, and it's happening daily. And again, just last week, there was a demolition in Jerusalem. If we look in the West Bank, I mean, literally just yesterday, a Palestinian village in the Jordan Valley was not only demolished, but also the people of the village were put onto buses and bussed away, like literal transfers happening right now. And we're hardly talking about it and hardly seeing it. So it really is important to talk about that. Look at the links, look at what you can do around these things, not only how you can study and inform, but really what kind of actions you can do. I think that is really important. And Dawood, I don't know if you want to wrap it up, if you have some final comments around it.
Yeah, the Israeli strategy in implementing all of this is house by house and slowly. So, for example, when we look at Sheikh Jarrah, the first round was in 2009. Now, after 11 years, a second round is happening. When we talk about Silwan, something similar to this, all cities, something like this. So it's not in the mainstream media. They rarely use this massive expulsion and house evacuation in Jerusalem or any other areas. It's usually small pieces here and there, steps here and there, that does not sound like a mainstream issue or a political issue that is worth to even discuss, whether with Palestinians or with foreign governments. But again, and this is why it's always important to look at the big picture and then connect between what's daily happening and the big picture that is set for the city.
Great. So I think on that note, we can just really thank everyone for being here and hopefully both be in touch and take action on these things.
Thank you all.